Hi, and welcome back. In today's video, I want to show how I drew this illustration over a time-lapse recording. Over the course of the recording, there are a couple things I want to talk about. The first is how to incorporate textures into your drawings and how it can really elevate the illustration. And also really about how to push yourself out of your comfort zone when it comes to illustrations and try to maybe make yourself uncomfortable or try new things that you really haven't before. So as you can tell with this illustration, I'm doing something very different. I am first starting off with a black canvas. So I filled my canvas with the paint bucket tool. And instead of, grabbing a pencil brush and starting sketching out my shapes, working out my forms, before progressing to some cleanup work, I'm diving straight into my inking brush. Instead of working with a sketch, I'm using my inking brush to draw there's different terms for it. I like to call it negative inks. So this is working in a very subtractive manner. So I'm not building up my shadows in this illustration like you normally would. Normally on a piece of paper or when you're working digitally, you usually start off with a white canvas. And from that, you're doing what's an additive experience. You're adding shadows to your illustration, you're adding forms, you're adding shapes. In this method, we're kind of working in the opposite. When you're working traditionally from a white canvas, you're sort of building things up from scratch. You do a gesture drawing, you build up your shapes, you sort of define what it is that you're drawing very early on in broad general shapes. But with this method, when you're working sort of backwards, you're kind of feeling things out in a very different way. You're applying the exact same principles. When you're seeing the drawing here, I'm still following the principles of shapes and forms and trying to make sure I'm capturing energy. I'm trying to use gestures, but I'm just doing it in a very different way. I'm trying to reverse my thought process here. Now, why do I want to do this? There's a couple of reasons. First and foremost is exactly what I just mentioned before. I really want to push myself out of my comfort zone. And I like to do this occasionally. I don't do this all the time, but your comfort zone is there for a reason. What you've studied, what you've practiced, what you know, that's tremendous. It really helps you, especially when maybe you're in a dark period in your creativity and you're really struggling on coming up with an illustration or that sort of thing. Your comfort zone can be a great source where you go to a character that you're feeling really comfortable with, or a scenario or poses that you really like. That's great. That gives you a sense of being centered when you're drawing, and that's fantastic. The downside of that is that when you build that level of comfort, when you build that level of complacency, I guess is another word you can use here, it really means that you're not really progressing because you're just relying on what you know and what you feel the most comfortable with. So it is a great idea to every once in a while to push yourself out of your comfort zone, to try something new. Maybe it's a new technique. That's what I'm doing here. This is a technique I'm not accustomed to. This is not something but by any means I feel really natural to. And you see that I rely on the same principles from drawing from a white canvas and building up my shapes. You can see here I did like a general outline of my shapes first before I dived into this particular technique. And I struggled with it. You can see me struggling with it right now. I'm having a hard time defining the shape on Batman's face. It's not the usual character mood I try to get across with Batman. It's a character that I draw many times. I love this character. I think I know this character very, very intimately. But even with all that, I'm still struggling because this is a very different technique and a very different way of thinking. And that's valuable. It's amazing because you're doing a couple things here. First, you're building up a new skill set. You're questioning your techniques. You're really forcing yourself in a situation where you're actively thinking about what you're doing, which is a downside of, doing something that you're familiar with all the time, is that at a certain point, your brain goes onto autopilot. That means you're not being critical of what you're doing, you're not questioning what you're doing, you're not asking yourself the whys as much as maybe you should be. And that's perfectly normal. Again, as I mentioned, that comfort space, it can be really fantastic when you're struggling and you just need to fall back on something, get a quick win so you can feel confident again, so you can go and tackle a project or a particular piece. But if that's your only space that you're operating in, that you're only drawing the same characters or same type of characters over and over again, or the same type of pose, the same type of compositions, then what you find is that you're not really growing, and that when you are asked to or put in a position where you need to draw something that's outside of those standards that you've set for yourself, you really don't know how to deal with it because you haven't really equipped your problem-solving skills with the ability to tackle that. And that's sort of the true benefit of putting yourself outside of those comfort zones, is because then at that point you're actively engaging your problem-solving skills. And that comes into play in a variety of ways. It comes to play with your composition, it comes into play with your technique, and it comes definitely into your fundamentals, like rethinking of your fundamentals or questioning what your fundamentals are. So in this particular piece, you see me working from light to dark instead of from dark to light. When you're working from light to dark, you have to really quickly identify, where your light source is and be very consistent with that. Working from dark to light, because you can sort of cheat it sometimes where you're working with multiple light sources, or if, as long as it just kind of looks right, you can sort of get away with really being critical or thinking too deeply about your light sources. In this technique where I'm using a single light source and I'm working from light to dark, this puts us in a position where I have to constantly think about, what is my lighting here? What are my shapes here? How am I defining those shapes? How am I being consistent with the light source? So that is, one thing from working with this technique that's forcing me to think about and how to solve those problems. The second thing is working from light to dark forces me to think about composition in a way that I might not normally think about it working from light to dark. Not to say that composition is something that you don't think about from light to dark, or from dark to light. Light from dark. Even I'm getting confused. Not to say you don't think about those things. It's just, again, when you put yourself outside your comfort zone and you're dealing with something new, it activates those things that you sort of take for granted, and you have to think about them a lot more deeply. So in this situation, in my composition, because I'm working from light to dark, I'm really thinking about a contrast. I'm also thinking about how to position the characters, because because I'm not really working with a whole lot of line art here. I'm really working with sort of the light itself. I don't want these figures colliding with each other in a way where I'm confusing the shapes as a viewer. So if you're looking at this for the first time, and if I had maybe these characters a little bit closer together, or if some elements were overlapping, it wouldn't read as clear. And that would be a problem on a composition level that I can easily solve by just taking a second and think about how I'm positioning these elements, where the dark's going to be, where my lights are going to be. And that helps me create a better illustration, a better composition, because this challenge that I'm working with, light to dark, is forcing me to come up with new solutions and new ideas. So that's a prime example of how working outside of your comfort level can really elevate your art. Maybe not in this piece in particular, but some of the lessons learned and maybe some of the realizations that you have you can really learn from this exercise, and then sort of take that with you. Now, switching up from light to dark or dark to light, that's just one example, sort of getting yourself outside of your comfort zone. Another method that I like to use very often is switching up what I'm drawing. I love to draw fan art illustrations. That's sort of 90% of the illustrations that I do are sort of typical fan art, characters in poses or characters in backgrounds. And these are usually superhero characters. So if I want to change things up and I really want to challenge myself, I will try to draw things that aren't that. I will draw forests, I will draw cars, I will spend sometimes just drawing buildings. Props is a great one. Taking a prop and drawing in multiple different angles. Those things really force me to confront some of my shortcomings as an illustrator and make me think a little bit more deeply about the fundamentals: shape, volume, perspective, contrast, and composition if it's more of an illustration rather than an exercise. It will just force me to confront all of my bad habits and sort of make me question some of the decisions that I would normally make on autopilot, and really force me to think more deeply and more critically about what I'm trying to accomplish. Now, I mentioned before how that comfort zone can really help you when you're in a rut and you really need to maybe reset, build your confidence again before tackling on a project that you sort of feel stumped by. The same is true of tackling a challenge like this. It seems counterintuitive, but if you're stuck, if you feel like you're struggling with the illustration, you're struggling with the project, and everything that you put down isn't what you envision it to be, isn't communicating properly what it is you want to communicate, and it's very frustrating. I know that emotion. I know that feeling. Trust me, I've been there. And sometimes your comfort zone isn't going to help you with that. Sometimes your comfort zone is the thing that you're stuck with, ironically. Or you feel like when you do your comfort zone, it doesn't really seem to solve the problem that you're facing, or doesn't really inspire you the way that you want it to. Putting yourself, doing an exercise like this where you're trying something new, trying something different, switching up your techniques, which is, by the way, another great way of putting yourself out of your comfort zone. If subject isn't your problem, but you feel like you need to push yourself, try switching up your techniques. Maybe draw on paper if you're a digital artist. Maybe do digital painting if you're used to doing like more traditional like manga-like art. Sort of switching up your techniques is also a great way of forcing you out of your comfort zone. But back to my earlier thought, putting yourself, if you're in a rut and putting yourself in an uncomfortable position like this, where you're working in a technique that you don't work with normally, that is another fantastic way to resolve some of those creative blocks that you have. Because when you work in a new situation and you're struggling with, like in this particular case, we're going from light to dark and I'm struggling with it, but eventually, as you see in this illustration, I start to figure things out. That eureka moment can also build your confidence just on the same level as drawing something that you're very comfortable with and you can draw well, and you go ahead and draw it and it looks great and you feel awesome. Show it to your friends and say, hey, that's awesome. You feel great. The same can be true about drawing something that you're not familiar with. Because when you accomplish that, your confidence level skyrockets. You feel like a rock star because you've solved something, you did something new. And that can be just as effective as drawing something that you're very comfortable with. So again, this is something I highly recommend. If you're feeling stuck, if you feel like you're not progressing as an artist, or you're working on a project that is really stumping you, I would say take 30 minutes out of your day, out of your week, and just try to push yourself, challenge yourself, and just let your brain sort of just activate those problem-solving skills and try to see if you can accomplish something that you haven't considered before. And trust me, guys, even if you don't succeed in that, the act of doing it, it does something to your brain where it starts buzzing and you start thinking of ideas. And if you go back to the project that you're working on, or if you come back to your drawing board after going through an exercise like this, I guarantee you start looking at that page very differently. It feels less intimidating, it feels less frustrating, and you start thinking about how to solve the problem rather than feeling trapped by the problem, which is huge. That's fantastic. The other thing I want to talk about briefly on this video, maybe I'll spend another video talking about this in more depth, but one of the things that I sort of figured out as I was going along with this illustration was the importance of how texture was going to come into play with this illustration. As I said, this is like a light to dark situation, so I'm using a lot of lights, a lot of contrast to really define the characters. I'm automatically adding drama to this situation because there's so much blacks, and that creates that contrast and definition between the two characters. That part's great, but what I felt really elevated this illustration was all the textures I was able to infuse the Man-Bat character with. And in turn, that created a sense of contrast from the Batman figure in this illustration. As you can tell with the Man-Bat figure, the brushstrokes are very messy, very naturalistic, very animalistic. And I was able to really work on that leather texture on the wings, which I was really proud of. I experimented with using a cross-hatching brush, softening that by going over that with a little bit of blacks once I put those cross-hatching down, and then working in quickly with a sharp black line, the texture of the pebble texture of the bat wings. And it goes without saying that I was only really to accomplish this when halfway through, I didn't like how the Man-Bat character was looking, didn't feel menacing, didn't have that sense of authenticity to it. So I opened up some references, and that's when those ideas really started to spark. It's like, oh, I can take this element. Oh, I can make the wings thinner. Oh, I don't really need to show the claws. What I need to do is show that expanding wingspan to show the intimidation of this character hovering over Batman. That's what I really need to do. And once I started getting inspired by the reference to make those changes, then I really felt this illustration started to come to life. And then with the Batman figure, I tried to keep the shapes of the cape more clean versus what was going on with the Man-Bat character, because I wanted that contrast of textures between the characters to show the difference between the characters. One, that the cleaner lines on Batman really makes him stick out in the foreground as opposed to the messier, softer brushes I used for Man-Bat. So you get a sense of depth that way, but also I wanted to create a contrast of who these two characters are. You know, one is a man dressed as a bat, and one is a man that's been transformed into a bat. So there's similarities, but distinctions there. And I really wanted to illustrate that in this particular drawing. So that was my drawing. Hope you guys enjoyed watching along and hear my thoughts on going through this process. If you guys have your own experiences you want to share about facing challenges drawings and how you guys overcome that, or taking on a challenging project, please share in the comments below. I'd love to hear them. If you guys enjoyed this video, hit that like button. If you want to see more, hit that subscribe button. And until next time, keep drawing.